So then after that, what we would do is here just implement the headers. So to implement the headers, I'm just going to create a list of them. So list. And then to implement headers with the Apache HTTP client, we're going to be using name value pair. So just going to import list, and then after that what we're going to do is just name our list. Parameters is equal to new array list, and then what we're going to do is just leave that as is, and then initialize our parameters by adding them to the list. And as I said before, we have three parameters. So the first one being add, and then since our list is going to be made out of name value pairs, which with the HTTP client are parameters, so what we're going to do is add the name value pair. So new basic name value pair. So, and then we're going to call it start, and then that's what the name, and then the value is going to be 1. So alright, so now what we're gonna do is add new, and then we're gonna add our second one, basic name value pair start, limit, and then have it to be 5,000. And then what we're gonna do now is we're gonna implement the third parameter, which was USD, or what we're gonna the currency we want to convert the crypto to in terms of the price. So new basic name value pair, and then this is gonna be convert, and then it's gonna be USD. And now you could edit this my code however way you want. Let's say you wanted to fetch a different endpoint, or you wanted it to convert into a different currency, you could do that as well. So now what we're going to do is actually make the API call. So for that, we're going to create a try catch block, and then in that block we'll execute the make API call function. So try, and then what we're going to do is in that try we're going to have our result. Our result is going to be the response of make API call, and then this is just going to be a function that we'll create, and then we'll pass in our URI and parameters, and then this is going to be the result or response that we get in form of JSON. And then after that I'm just going to just print the result, and then from here you could do whatever you want after we make the API call. So you could parse the JSON to set up a proper UI, so you could have each of them being monitored, or you could retrieve the charts and create a search engine for crypto. Anything you want basically for the in terms of what you can do with the response. So now I'm just gonna add a catch block. So IO exception, and then we'll just call it e dot print stack trace, and then we're actually going to add one more catch, a syntax exception as well, because syntaxes can be there's a chance that exceptions can be also called. So let's say you had a typo or something like that, it may not be displayed as easy, so you would want to put the syntax exception, and it would just let you know whether you had a URI, right? I spelled it wrong. It's URI syntax exception. So I'm going to do now and then after this, what I'm just going to do is the same e dot print stack trace, and then there's this here, and then alright, we can just leave that as is, or you could just collapse the stack blocks. It wouldn't make much of a difference, as it says here. You could do the same thing. This is just a shortcut you could do if this is the or thing. So if this or this comes. It's just a time saver in terms of code. So that's the thing I do like about IntelliJ, is that it gives you these helpful reminders for time saving. Like here, gives you helpful reminders and tips to save time in your code. So now let's make the make API call. Let's create this method. And then what we're gonna do now is gonna go down, and here it should return a string, which is going to be our JSON. So basically here, this is where the main like block of our code, chunk of our code is going to go, because now we're actually going to be making the API request to the endpoint that we initialized here. But before we do that, what are these two errors? Is never thrown but in the corresponding try block. Okay. And what is this? The net URI is never thrown in the corresponding try block. Oh, and oh yeah, it's because it's happening because since this function that we're gonna create here needs to throw the API call. This function, this needs to, because right now the catch block is basically saying that we this try function, this try block does not have any IO or URI syntax exception thrown, or have any risk of getting thrown. So we need to throw it in our make API call, because that's where we're actually going to perform the that's where any IO exception or syntax exception would actually come. So we're gonna in our function we'll throw I we're gonna throw here, we're gonna throw our throws IO exception, and the other one URI syntax exception. Alright, so now that we've thrown our exception, I'm just gonna push this back here. Alright, now that we've done that, now let's create the HTTP request for the endpoint. So first of all, I'll just create a string to hold our response content, and then we'll just call it that. Alright. So now what we're gonna do is use the org.apache.http client to actually essentially build our HTTP request. Because in Java, you use the built-in client or any client to create the HTTP. First, you would initialize your parameters, then you would initialize the type of request, then lastly you would add any headers, which in this case would be our API key. So lastly we would close the HTTP response and then return it in the function. So now what we're gonna do is go down, and then what we're gonna do now is add a URI builder, and we'll just call it the query, which is going to be the query for our request. URI builder. All right, now that we've done that, now we're just gonna do and then we're just gonna pass in our API endpoint, and then after that, what we're gonna do is now we're going to add our parameters. So in this case, it's parameters, and then now what we'll do is we'll add now we're gonna actually implement our HTTP client, which in this case is it's gonna be, the library is called closable HTTP client. So I'll just type it out here. This basically allows us to create a client in which we can we'll run our API request to the endpoint via an HTTP protocol, and we can add our headers, we can add our API key parameters, etc., etc. So closable HTTP client, and then we'll just call it our client is equal to new, or actually we'll create it using the HTTP client. HTTP client dot create a HTTP client, and I spelled that misspelling a lot of things. HTTP client dot create default, and then after that, HTTP, and then as I said before in the API documentation, if we go back to it here, the request here is a get request. Say get request. So this get, because it's a get request, we're gonna set the type of we're gonna set the type of request in the HTTP client. We're gonna do initialize an HTTP get request. So this is basically what our request is. So a new HTTP get, and then after that, we're just gonna build our request using that URI builder, and then we're just going to do query.build. This will basically just allow us to put in our parameters and whatever else that we add in our request. So right now we have a get request in place with the parameters. So now the last thing we need to do is set the headers, and then after that we will be able to close the request, generate a response, and then return it to the API call, make API call function. So after this, we're gonna perform request. Now we're gonna set header, and then this header is gonna be HTTP headers dot accept, and then it's gonna be a type of application, and it's gonna be a JSON, not dot JSON slash JSON. Okay. Oop, all right, that's spelled right. So now what we're gonna do is add one more header, because in your default JSON request response scenario with a HTTP protocol, you typically have your accept header with the application JSON. This is basically telling your API or endpoint that you want the response in the form of a JSON. But for this specific endpoint and a lot of API endpoints, we're going to add a header, a extra header that's going to be the API key. So this is the time where you're going to be using your API key. So we're going to set the header, and its name is, I actually have it here. It's a bit of a lengthy, or I guess you could say weird name. So it's not weird, but it's a bit of a lengthy name. So XCMC Pro API key. So this is basically the name of this is basically what your endpoint renders as an API key. So when it goes to your request, once it sees this header, it'll know that this is the API key. This is what I need to use for it. So now just gonna put API key, and then after that, so now we have set our headers. So basically we have a ready HTTP request that we now need to generate a response for. So we're going to be using a closable HTTP response in this case. So now we're going to type that in as response is equal to, and then this now we're going to use our client, and that client is going to execute our HTTP request right here. Now that we've done that, now what we're going to do is now we're going to set up a try catch block and actually get the response. So this is where the IO exception and URI exception are typically thrown. So we're going to set up a try catch block, capture our response, and then return it. So we're going to set up a try block, and then we're gonna add, in this case we're gonna add a finally. So because we've already thrown the exceptions via the function in IO and URI syntax, we won't need to catch them, but we will need a finally block. So this finally block will basically just close the we'll close the response HTTP response, so that then we can end the API call, so that we don't get a looping or just infinite call. So here in try, what we're gonna do is, first of all, I'm gonna print out with via SOUT the status line. So but this is basically the HTTP status code. So you have your 200, and it actually lists it in the documentation. So if we go here, these are the response samples that you could get: 200, 400, 401, 402, and 403, 429, and 500. So these are the responses you can get. All of these are errors except for the 200. So in this case, we're going to be looking for a 200, HTTP 200 success. So just going to print out SOUT print, and then I'm going to print response.get status line SOUT, and then at this point you could just do whatever you want with this data. You could pass it into a database, you could do whatever you want if you were using this code for, let's say, a different type of application. So in this case, we're just going to be printing it to the console response dot, and then here what we're going to do is get the entity. So get entity basically, let me just type it out here. Get entity basically means the actual currencies. So that sample JSON response file that we saw earlier, this, the Bitcoin, Ethereum, etc., this is basically the entity. So that's what we want to get. That's the basically the main chunk of what we actually want. So then we're gonna SOUT, and by the way, SOUT is a very helpful shortcut for printing a string to this to the system.out, and this shortcut exists in Java. I think it's something different. Yeah, it exists in IntelliJ. I'm not sure what it is in Eclipse. I know there's a shortcut for this in Eclipse, but I'm not sure what it is. So you feel free to look that down. And then lastly, we have response. And then actually, we're not gonna print this. I just realized that we need to set our response content to something, because in the end that's what we're going to be returning. So here what we're going to do is response content is going to be equal to the entity, and then entity utils. This is the utilities of the JSON response. So in this case, we're just gonna do .toString, and then we're just gonna pass in the end entity. So we need to pass in an HTTP entity. So we can't pass in that. Okay, pass in. Let's just pass in response dot get entity, and then that should be good. All right, and then lastly we have response content, and then we've stringed it out so that the reason we have this line is so that it's in a displayable format.